This video discusses a tragic case as a way to raise awareness about child safety and investigation challenges. Nothing here should be taken as an accusation against any individual.
I'm not saying parents don't kill their kids. Parents do kill their children. So, but they're trying to say, Patsy, that their actions before, during, and after are all consistent with innocent people. They didn't do it.
I thought there was something drastically wrong and that there was a gross injustice in this case. I had seen evidence of an intruder in the house that night.
$118,000. Remember that number because in just a few minutes you'll understand why this exact amount holds the key to one of America's most haunting unsolved mysteries. But first, I need to tell you about a piece of paper that shouldn't exist. A ransom note that breaks every rule investigators expect. A note so bizarre, so impossibly detailed that it turned a family's Christmas nightmare into decades of suspicion, accusation, and unanswered questions. On December 26, 1996, at 5:52 a.m., Patsy Ramsey's bare feet hit the cold hardwood floor of her Boulder, Colorado home. She's heading downstairs to start coffee before her family's early flight to Michigan. But she never makes it to the kitchen because there, across the bottom steps of her spiral staircase, lies 3 handwritten pages that will change her life forever. Mr. Ramsey, listen carefully. We are a group of individuals that represent a small foreign faction. We respect your business, but not the country that it serves. If you're already hooked and want to see how this impossible mystery unfolds, hit that like and subscribe button right now, because this story gets darker with every revelation, and I need to know where you're watching from. Drop your location in the comments because this case has captivated people worldwide for nearly 3 decades. Patsy's hands tremble as she reads on. The note demands exactly $118,000 for her 6-year-old daughter, JonBenét's safe return. But here's what makes your blood run cold. As Patsy races upstairs to check JonBenét's bedroom, her daughter's bed is empty. The covers are pulled back. JonBenet is gone, but that's not the most unsettling part. What happens next will make you question everything you think you know about this case, because investigators suspected it involved more than an abduction. This was something far more complex, something that happened inside this house on Christmas night. And the ransom note Patsy discovered wasn't written by strangers. It was written by someone who knew intimate details about their lives, someone who knew about JonBenét Ramsey's Christmas bonus, someone comfortable enough to sit inside their home for an extended period crafting this elaborate deception, while a little girl would later be located in the basement under troubling circumstances. This is the story of JonBenét Ramsey. And before we're done, you'll understand why this case has never been solved, why a grand jury once considered charges against the parents, and why DNA evidence has both cleared suspects and created new mysteries. At 6:00 a.m. on December 26th, the first Boulder police officer arrives at the Ramsey home. Officer Rick French expects a standard call. Instead, he walks into a scene so complicated by activity that it will impact the investigation before it even truly begins. But nobody realizes this yet, because everyone still believes JonBenét might be alive. Within an hour, the house fills with people. Family, friends, a victim's advocate, and neighbors arrive. The police count 7 different people walking through what should have been a secured scene. Actions were taken that complicated later forensic review. But here's what nobody understands yet. The primary scene isn't outside this house, it's inside. And while officers searched the neighborhood, JonBenét remained undiscovered just 1 floor below them. Officer French makes 3 separate trips to the basement. He tries the door to a small wine cellar, but it's latched shut. He doesn't force it open. This decision will haunt him forever, because behind that door, JonBenét was later located under a white blanket. 8 hours pass, the deadline comes and goes with no phone call. By afternoon, Detective Linda Arndt suggests John Ramsey and a family friend search the house top to bottom. John Ramsey approaches the wine cellar door, flicks up the latch, and pushes it open. The scream that comes from the basement stops all conversation upstairs. What he discovers in that small, windowless room will be seared into his memory forever. Materials were reportedly found at the scene. An improvised device constructed from cord and a broken paintbrush handle was associated with elements investigators later described as staging. Seeing his daughter in this condition, John Ramsey does not preserve the scene. Instead, he moves her upstairs, unintentionally compromising key forensic evidence. By the time Detective Arndt sees him emerge from the basement, the original scene has been irreparably altered. The autopsy would later reveal that forensic findings were interpreted as restriction contributing to critical outcomes. She also had a significant head injury finding described by medical examiners. The coroner determined a sequence of actions that investigators later characterized as staged. The improvised device itself tells a revealing story. Someone took time to craft it, breaking a paintbrush from Patsy's art supplies, tying knots, and creating a handle for leverage. This suggested premeditation, or at minimum, extended time after the initial injury, and then there were the other materials found at the scene. Why place materials after she was already incapacitated? Why create an improvised device when the head injury alone could have been sufficient? These questions would puzzle investigators for decades. The scene revealed other puzzling details. A basement window appeared to have been disturbed. Is this where an intruder entered, or was it staged? Most bizarrely, there were no footprints in the fresh snow outside. If someone entered from outside, how did they avoid leaving any trace? But the biggest question remains the ransom note itself. Now that JonBenét had been located, the note made no sense. Why write a ransom demand for someone already missing inside the house? Why craft such an elaborate deception if the goal was something else? Detective Arndt found herself alone in a house with multiple potential suspects and a complicated scene. The evidence already suggested something that would divide investigators for years to come. Was this an intruder who somehow entered and exited without leaving tracks? Or was this someone who was already inside the house, someone who knew the layout, had access to Patsy's paintbrushes and notepad, and intimate knowledge of John's finances? Because here's what makes that $118,000 ransom demand so chilling. It was almost exactly the amount of JonBenét Ramsey's Christmas bonus, information that only someone very close to the family would know. The house that was supposed to hold answers had instead generated more questions. And as investigators began to process what they found, one fact became increasingly clear. The life of a young girl was tragically lost not by strangers who broke into her home, but possibly by someone who belonged there. The first photographs hit the media within hours of JonBenét being discovered, and they shocked America in ways no one anticipated. Here was a 6-year-old child, but the images showed something very different. Styled hair, makeup, formal gowns, and stage poses more typical of adult beauty pageants than of everyday childhood play. If you're unsettled by what I'm describing, you're not alone. Leave a comment about how these images made you feel, because the public reaction to JonBenét's pageant photos became almost as controversial as the case itself. JonBenét Patricia Ramsey wasn't just any child. She was a veteran of the child beauty pageant circuit, with titles that included Little Miss Colorado, Colorado State All-Star Kids Cover Girl, and America's Royale Misses. And these weren't small local competitions. They were high-level pageants with professional coaching, funding, and strong competition. Patsy Ramsey knew this world intimately. She had been Miss West Virginia in 1977, competing in the Miss America pageant. When JonBenét was born, Patsy saw an opportunity to return to that world. What began as occasional mother-daughter pageants quickly became a significant part of JonBenét's childhood. Videos from JonBenét's pageant performances reveal a child who clearly enjoyed the spotlight. She sings with confidence, poses with precision, and seems to love being on stage, but these same videos, when viewed by a public already learning about her case, took on a more controversial quality. The child in these photos doesn't look 6 years old. The styling, makeup, and costumes created an aesthetic that many viewers felt was inappropriate. Critics argued that presenting children this way raised concerns about inappropriate public perception, while pageant supporters maintained that these were simply glamorous competitions, no different from youth sports. What the media coverage often missed in its rush to judge was that JonBenét was a normal child outside of competitions. School photos show a gap-toothed girl with natural blonde hair and no makeup, grinning with typical childhood joy. Friends describe her as playful and sweet. Teachers reported no behavioral concerns. The disconnect between pageant JonBenét and everyday JonBenét became a central focus of media coverage, but it may have distracted from more important questions about her case. Instead of focusing on who was responsible for what happened to this child, much of the public discussion centered on whether her participation in pageants somehow contributed to the tragic outcome. This narrative gained traction when investigators began looking at adults in her pageant world as potential suspects. Pageant photographers had taken thousands of images of JonBenét. Judges and officials knew her personally. Competitions meant traveling and interacting with numerous adults. One particular individual emerged from this connection. A photographer who had worked multiple pageants where JonBenét competed became a person of interest when investigators learned he had a prior record that raised concerns. But like every other suspect in this case, his DNA didn't match evidence found at the scene, and he was eventually cleared. The pageant angle also raised questions about the Ramsey family dynamics. How much of JonBenét's pageant career was her choice versus her mother's encouragement? Friends and relatives offered conflicting accounts. Some said JonBenét loved performing, while others suggested Patsy was the driving force. Burke Ramsey, JonBenét's 9-year-old brother, largely avoided the pageant world. He preferred video games and model airplanes. Was there favoritism in the household? Did Burke resent the attention JonBenét received? These questions would become central to some investigators' theories. The media's fixation on the pageant photos created a narrative that the Ramsey family faced internal pressures. This narrative made it easier for the public to believe that something terrible could have happened within this family. But the pageant focus also revealed America's complicated relationship with childhood beauty. Many viewers were disturbed by the images, while others argued that pageants were harmless fun. National magazines put JonBenét on their covers week after week, almost always using pageant photos. People magazine alone featured her multiple times, each cover emphasizing the stylized images. These editorial choices ensured that public perception of JonBenét remained tied to the pageant world. The international attention was unprecedented for a case involving a child. European media covered the story extensively, often expressing shock at American child beauty pageants. Television programs dedicated entire episodes to analyzing her performances, but these analyses contributed little to solving her case. The pageant world itself responded defensively, emphasizing that competitions taught confidence and poise. However, the intense scrutiny did lead to changes in how child pageants operated, with many organizations modifying rules about makeup and costumes. But all of this cultural analysis obscured the central questions that should have dominated coverage. Who was in the Ramsey house that night? Who knew about John's bonus amount? Who had access to Patsy's art supplies and notepad? The pageant photos became a distraction from the real investigation, but they also served a purpose for those who wanted to shift suspicion onto the parents. If the public viewed the family as troubled, it became easier to believe they might have been involved. As we'll see, this public perception would become crucial as investigators began to focus their attention on John and Patsy Ramsey themselves. 2.5 pages, 374 words, 26 lines of handwriting that contain more clues about the individual responsible for what happened to JonBenét than any other piece of evidence in this case. But this ransom note breaks every rule, and the more investigators analyzed it, the more convinced they became that it was written by someone very familiar with the Ramsey family. If you've ever wondered what makes this ransom note so suspicious, drop a comment with your theory about who wrote it. By the end of this section, you'll understand why it's the most important piece of evidence in the entire case. Genuine ransom notes are short, direct, and designed to minimize the writer's exposure. Individuals behind such acts don't want to spend time crafting elaborate messages that could provide handwriting samples. They don't want to include unnecessary details that might reveal their identity, and they definitely don't want to sit in the family's house for the 30 to 45 minutes it would take to write nearly 400 words by hand. But the JonBenét ransom note violates every one of these principles. It's not just long, it's conversational, almost chatty in places. It includes movie references, political statements, and warnings that seem designed more for dramatic effect than practical communication. Most telling of all, it was written on paper from inside the Ramsey house, using a pen found there by someone comfortable enough to spend significant time crafting this elaborate deception. The note begins with formal language. Listen carefully. We are a group of individuals that represent a small foreign faction. We respect your business, but not the country that it serves. This opening tries to establish the writers as organized and politically motivated, but then the tone shifts dramatically. The note becomes personally threatening and strangely specific. At this time, we have your daughter in our possession. She is safe and unharmed, and if you want her to reach the new year, you must follow our instructions to the letter. Why mention 1997 specifically? A genuine abductor might use more general phrasing. The reference to the specific year suggests someone thinking about JonBenét's age, someone who knew she would turn 7 in 1997. This is the kind of detail a family member might include, not an outsider demanding ransom. The most striking clue comes in the financial demand itself. The note requests exactly $118,000, described as a reasonable sum. How would strangers know anything about the size of John's business? How would they know his first name? But here's the shocking detail that proves the writer knew intimate information about the Ramsey family finances. John's Christmas bonus from his company was $118,117.50. The ransom demand was within $100 of this amount. This wasn't a coincidence. This was someone who had direct knowledge of his year-end compensation. The note continues with warnings that seem more designed for drama than compliance. If we monitor you getting the money early, we might call you early to arrange an earlier delivery of the money and hence an earlier delivery of your daughter. The sentence structure is awkward and repetitive, suggesting someone trying to sound more sophisticated than they actually were. Even more unusual is this passage. The delivery will be exhausting, so I advise you to be rested. If we catch you talking to a stray dog, there will be serious consequences. If you alert bank authorities, there will be consequences. If the money is in any way marked or tampered with, consequences will follow. You will be scanned for electronic devices, and if any are found, consequences will follow. The reference to a stray dog is so unusual that investigators analyzed it extensively, believing it could be a reference to a family joke or inside knowledge. Most telling of all, the note was clearly written inside the Ramsey house. Not only was it on paper from Patsy's notepad, but investigators found what appeared to be practice attempts on earlier pages of the same pad. Someone had started writing, decided they didn't like it, and started over. Think about what this means. The writer was comfortable enough to sit down with Patsy's notepad and pen, craft multiple versions, and take the time necessary to write nearly 400 words. They weren't worried about being discovered. They were treating the house like their own home. The handwriting analysis became a crucial part of the investigation. While not an exact science, several experts concluded that Patsy Ramsey couldn't be ruled out as the author, noting characteristics consistent with samples of her normal handwriting. However, other experts concluded she was not the author. The inconclusive nature of the analysis meant it could only suggest, not prove. The note ends with a final dramatic flourish. Use that good Southern common sense of yours. It is up to you now, John. This closing reveals crucial details. The writer knows John is from the South and is addressing him personally and familiarly. But perhaps the most significant aspect of the ransom note is its purpose. If JonBenét was already beyond help when the note was written, As investigators later suggested, then the note served only one goal: to convince police that strangers had taken her. The note was designed to send investigators looking outside the house for suspects. It was meant to buy time while police searched the neighborhood. During those crucial first hours, while police treated the house as the scene of an abduction rather than a different kind of incident, stories could be coordinated and the scene could be further complicated. The strategy almost worked. Police spent the entire morning of December 26 treating the case as an abduction in progress. They didn't search the house thoroughly because they believed JonBenét had been taken elsewhere. The ransom note successfully misdirected the initial investigation exactly as intended. But the note also created problems for whoever wrote it. The detailed knowledge of family finances, the familiarity with John's background, and the comfort level required to write such a lengthy note all pointed toward someone with intimate access to the Ramsey family. It was written by someone who had access to their home, their financial information, and their personal details. Someone who felt comfortable enough to sit in their house and craft an elaborate deception. And that realization would transform this investigation from a search for unknown individuals into a focused examination of everyone who had access to the Ramsey home on Christmas night. The list of people with that level of access was very short, and John and Patsy Ramsey were at the top of it. 3 days after JonBenét was located, something shifted. The theory of a random abduction was no longer viable. The intruder theory was becoming harder to support, and every piece of evidence seemed to point back to the same uncomfortable conclusion. Someone inside the Ramsey house was connected to the incident involving JonBenét. What happened next would divide this case for decades and turn a grieving family into America's most suspected parents. But here's what you need to understand about why investigators focused on John and Patsy Ramsey. And let me know in the comments if you think they were right to do so, because the evidence they were looking at was genuinely troubling. Statistics don't lie. In cases where a young child's life is tragically lost, family members are considered in the investigation over 80% of the time. Abductions by strangers that end with a critical outcome are extremely rare, especially when they involve elaborate ransom notes and incidents inside the family home. Boulder detectives knew these statistics, and they were trained to look at the most likely individuals first. But this wasn't just about statistics. The evidence was pointing towards someone with intimate knowledge of the Ramsey family, someone comfortable in their house, someone who knew about John's bonus and felt confident enough to spend significant time crafting a ransom note while family members slept upstairs. The pool of individuals with that level of access was very small. Detective Steve Thomas became convinced early on that Patsy Ramsey was connected to the incident involving her daughter. His theory, which he would later detail in a book, centered on what he believed was an accident that spiraled out of control. Thomas theorized that JonBenét had an accident Christmas night, that Patsy became upset about this and reacted in a way that caused unintended harm. According to this theory, the serious injury was accidental, but it was severe enough to cause a critical medical crisis. Realizing what had happened, Patsy then allegedly created an elaborate cover-up that included using the improvised mechanism to create misleading signs of restraint and writing the ransom note to suggest that intruders were responsible. This theory explains several puzzling aspects of the case. Why was JonBenét wearing different clothing? Thomas believed Patsy redressed her daughter as part of the staging. Why was there no obvious sign of forced entry? Because no one had entered the house from outside. Why did the ransom note contain so many personal details? Because it was written by a family member. Detective Thomas wasn't alone. Other investigators noticed that John and Patsy's behavior didn't match their expectations for parents coping with the loss of a child. They appeared calm during interviews and seemed more concerned with managing media coverage than cooperating. But what really raised suspicions was the decision to hire attorneys. Just days after JonBenét's case began, John and Patsy Ramsey retained criminal defense lawyers and stopped cooperating with police interviews. From the detective's perspective, this looked like consciousness of guilt. Innocent parents should want to help find the individual responsible for what happened to their daughter, not hide behind attorneys. The Ramseys saw it differently. They felt that Boulder police had already decided they were guilty and were trying to build a case against them rather than conducting an objective investigation. They noticed that media leaks from the police department consistently painted them in a negative light, while information that might support their innocence never seemed to reach reporters. The hiring of attorneys created a standoff that lasted for months. Police wanted formal interviews. The Ramseys' attorneys wanted to protect their clients from what they saw as a rush to judgment by inexperienced investigators under tremendous public pressure. Meanwhile, the media coverage was becoming increasingly hostile. Tabloid magazines ran stories suggesting sensitive and unverified claims about John and that Patsy's actions were meant to conceal them. Television programs featured body language experts analyzing their public statements for signs of deception. This media attention served to further convince police that the Ramseys were guilty. Their continued refusal to participate in formal interviews was seen as evidence that they had something to hide. But the Ramseys' legal team was watching this same media coverage and concluding that their clients couldn't receive a fair investigation. Every detail leaked to the press seemed designed to make them look guilty. Information that supported their innocence, such as the lack of their DNA at key parts of the scene, wasn't being shared with the media. The investigation began to leak constantly. Details about the scene, the ransom note, and potential evidence were appearing in newspapers almost daily, and almost all of it cast suspicion on the parents. Some leaks were clearly designed to generate public pressure. Stories appeared suggesting that Burke had provided information that contradicted his parents' statements. Other leaks implied that forensic evidence was presented as suggesting family involvement, though these claims were often exaggerated. The strategy backfired. Instead of forcing cooperation, the media leaks convinced the Ramseys that Boulder police couldn't be trusted. Their attorneys argued that anything they said in interviews would be leaked to the press in the most damaging way possible. This created a vicious cycle. Police became more convinced of their guilt because of their refusal to cooperate. The Ramseys became more convinced that police had predetermined their guilt because of the constant negative leaks. And the real investigation, the search for the individual actually responsible for the incident involving JonBenét, ground to a halt as both sides dug in. The public watched all of this unfold. The Ramseys appeared on CNN with their attorneys, proclaiming their innocence and asking the responsible party to come forward. Police sources responded by leaking more damaging information. It became a public relations war rather than a criminal investigation. But behind the media circus, investigators were building what they believed was a strong circumstantial case against the Ramseys. They had opportunity since they were in the house when the incident concerning JonBenét occurred. They had means since the items used in the incident came from inside the house. And they believed they had motive, though theories about that motive varied widely. The access issue was crucial. Boulder detectives became convinced that whoever was responsible for the incident had to be someone who belonged in the house, someone who could move around without waking others, who knew where to find art supplies and notepads, and who could spend substantial time writing a ransom note without fear of discovery. They also pointed to what they saw as staging at the scene. The basement window that appeared to have been disturbed from the inside rather than outside, the lack of footprints in the snow around any entrance, and the positioning of JonBenét under a blanket, which seemed to show care rather than the indifference one might expect from a stranger. But the Ramseys had their own explanations for all of these details. John had disturbed the basement window months earlier when he locked himself out, and it had never been repaired. The lack of footprints didn't prove anything since paved walkways led to several entrances, and covering JonBenét with a blanket could have been done by an intruder who felt remorse after realizing the consequences of his actions. What investigators found most suspicious was the family's behavior in the days following the incident. Instead of staying in Boulder to help with the investigation, the Ramseys flew to Atlanta for the funeral and remained there for several weeks. They hired a public relations firm, gave carefully orchestrated interviews, but refused to submit to the kind of detailed questioning that might help find the individual responsible for what happened to their daughter. This behavior seemed calculated to avoid scrutiny rather than seek justice. Innocent parents, investigators believed, would do anything necessary to help find the person responsible for their child's case, even if it meant submitting to uncomfortable questions. But the Ramseys felt that Boulder police had already made up their minds, and that cooperating further would only provide more ammunition for prosecution. They were grieving parents who now found themselves facing accusations. Their priority was protecting their surviving child, Burke, from a media circus. The standoff continued for months. Police wanted extensive interviews with John and Patsy. The Ramseys' attorneys wanted assurance that their clients weren't already considered targets, and that any information provided would be used to find the responsible party rather than build a case against them. By the spring of 1997, the relationship between the family and Boulder police had broken down completely. The investigation was stalled, media coverage was increasingly hostile, and the chances of resolving JonBenét's case seemed to be slipping away. But pressure was building. The Boulder district attorney was facing criticism, the police department was under fire for their handling of the scene and for leaking information, and the public was demanding answers. The solution came in the form of a grand jury investigation, a way to compel testimony from witnesses. But what that grand jury would ultimately conclude would shock everyone involved and create even more questions. The focus on the parents wasn't just about evidence, it was also about what investigators expected grieving parents to look like. When John and Patsy didn't match those expectations, it raised suspicions. But there were other suspects being investigated during this same period, people who had access to the Ramsey house and knowledge about the family. These suspects received far less media attention, but they represented alternative theories. While Boulder police focused intensively on John and Patsy Ramsey, other investigators were pursuing leads that pointed toward intruders and individuals with ill intent outside the family. These alternative theories were based on genuine evidence and raised serious questions about whether police were looking in the right direction. The first category of suspects emerged from JonBenét's pageant world. Child beauty pageants create environments where young participants interact with numerous adults. Any of these individuals could have developed an inappropriate focus on JonBenét. If you're following along and have theories about other suspects who should have been investigated more thoroughly, share them in the comments because some of these alternative leads were more promising than authorities led on at the time. A photographer who had taken professional photos of JonBenét at pageants became a person of interest when investigators learned about his background. He had access to JonBenét through legitimate work, which meant he could observe her without raising suspicions. But when police investigated him thoroughly, they found no evidence connecting him to the case. His alibi for Christmas night was solid, and there was no physical evidence linking him to the scene. The pageant connection led investigators to consider whether the incident might be connected to a broader pattern of crimes involving minors in beauty competitions. They looked at similar cases in other states and investigated whether any known individuals had been following the pageant circuit, but no such connections were found. The incident appeared to be isolated, a finding that actually supported the theory that the responsible party was someone specifically connected to her family. A more promising lead emerged from the neighborhood. The months preceding the incident had seen a series of break-ins and other troubling incidents in the area surrounding the Ramsey home. These crimes shared certain characteristics. They involved intruders entering homes at night, appeared to target young females, and suggested the perpetrator was familiar with the neighborhood. One incident was particularly disturbing. A man had broken into a house just blocks from the Ramseys, reportedly entered a child's bedroom, and attempted inappropriate contact before being scared away. The description provided by the victim's family was of a white male of medium build. A detective who came out of retirement to work on the JonBenét case became convinced that these neighborhood crimes were connected to her case. He believed that an intruder had been observing the Ramsey house, planning an act that went wrong when JonBenét woke up or resisted. This intruder theory explains several aspects of the case that were difficult to reconcile with family involvement. An intruder planning to abduct JonBenét with harmful intentions might have prepared the ransom note in advance. When the abduction attempt resulted in a critical outcome, the note became irrelevant, but the intruder left it behind. The theory also explained the mixed signals at the scene. The careful placement of JonBenét under a blanket suggested remorse, which might be expected from someone whose plan had gone terribly wrong. The improvised mechanism could have been created by someone who needed to prevent JonBenét from alerting others. Most importantly, the intruder theory explained the DNA evidence. The DNA from an unidentified source found on JonBenét's clothing couldn't be matched to any family member or close associate. If this DNA came from the responsible party, then someone outside the family was involved. But the intruder theory had problems too. The undisturbed snow around the house made it difficult to explain an entry and exit. The familiarity with the house layout required to navigate to JonBenét's bedroom and then to the basement suggested inside knowledge rather than a random break-in. The most significant challenge to the intruder theory was the ransom note itself. The specific knowledge of John's bonus, the personal details, and the familiarity with his Southern background all suggested that the author knew the Ramseys well. A neighborhood prowler might know which house had a young daughter, but they wouldn't know intimate details about the father's finances. Detective Smith addressed these concerns by theorizing that the intruder had been observing the family long enough to overhear conversations or gain access to documents. He pointed out that the Ramseys were prominent members of Boulder society who attended numerous social events where personal information might be shared. The investigation expanded to include other categories of potential suspects. Anyone who had worked on the Ramsey house was investigated since they would have knowledge of the layout. This included contractors, repairmen, and housekeepers. One individual who generated significant interest was a man who had worked on the family's Christmas decorations. He had been inside the house multiple times and had the opportunity to observe their routines. But like other suspects, he was ultimately cleared when the investigation failed to produce evidence connecting him to the incident. The most dramatic suspect to emerge was John Mark Carr, who contacted a documentary filmmaker in 2006, claiming responsibility for what happened to JonBenét. Carr provided details that hadn't been released publicly and spoke about her in ways that suggested personal knowledge of her case. Carr's confession generated international headlines when he was arrested and brought to Boulder. He claimed to have been with JonBenét when she passed away, described it as an accident during a failed abduction scenario, and provided explanations that seemed to demonstrate inside knowledge. But his confession fell apart under scrutiny. Some details were inconsistent with evidence from the scene, and other information he claimed as inside knowledge had actually been reported in the media. Most damaging to his credibility, his DNA didn't match the unidentified forensic source found on JonBenét's clothing. The Carr episode highlighted a significant problem. The case's high profile attracted numerous false confessions. Each had to be investigated thoroughly, consuming resources and creating false hopes. But Carr's confession also demonstrated something important about the DNA evidence. Every major individual of interest in the case, including John and Patsy Ramsey, had been cleared because their DNA didn't match the profile from the unidentified source found at the scene. This suggested that either the DNA belonged to the individual responsible, or investigators were eliminating persons of interest based on DNA that may have been incidental to the case. The question of how much weight to give the DNA evidence would become increasingly important. If the DNA definitely came from the responsible party, then everyone who didn't match it was innocent. But if it came from another source, then investigators might be clearing the responsible party while chasing shadows. By 2008, the Boulder District Attorney's Office had officially cleared the Ramsey family based on new DNA testing techniques. But this clearance was based entirely on the assumption that the DNA evidence was definitive proof of the individual responsible. Other investigators weren't convinced. They argued that touch DNA, the type found on JonBenét's clothing, could have innocent explanations and shouldn't be used to eliminate individuals who were viable based on other evidence. They pointed out that many solved cases involve scenes where DNA from multiple people is found. The focus on alternative suspects and DNA evidence had shifted attention away from the family, but it hadn't solved the case. Each promising lead had been thoroughly investigated and ultimately eliminated. The neighborhood prowler theory couldn't explain the ransom note's personal details. The intruder theory couldn't account for the intimate setting inside the family home. As we'll see, the investigation would eventually focus on a grand jury proceeding that came to a surprising conclusion about who might be responsible for what happened to JonBenét. But that conclusion would create more questions than answers. In September 1998, nearly 2 years after the incident, Boulder District Attorney Alex Hunter announced he was convening a grand jury to examine all the evidence and determine whether charges should be filed in JonBenét's case. What the public didn't know was that this grand jury would reach a shocking conclusion that wouldn't be revealed for over a decade. And when that conclusion finally became public, it would raise more questions than it answered. The grand jury process is designed to be secret. But if you're wondering why this particular grand jury's findings were hidden from the public for so long, leave a comment with your theory because the answer reveals just how complicated and controversial this case had become. Grand juries are investigative tools that allow prosecutors to compel testimony. Unlike trial juries, they don't determine guilt or innocence. They only decide whether there's probable cause to believe that a crime was committed and that specific individuals were involved. This lower standard of proof made a grand jury perfect for the JonBenét case, where investigators had significant circumstantial evidence but lacked the definitive proof needed for a conviction for the act itself. Witnesses could be compelled to testify under oath. The grand jury was composed of 12 Boulder County citizens who would spend over a year examining evidence. They heard from dozens of witnesses, examined hundreds of pieces of evidence, and reviewed thousands of pages of reports. John and Patsy Ramsey were finally compelled to testify. Burke Ramsey, now 11 years old, also testified about what he remembered. Police officers, medical examiners, and forensic experts were all called to provide their perspective. The grand jury process took 13 months. Media attention remained intense, though little information leaked about what was being presented. Detective Steve Thomas, who had resigned from the police department in frustration, was among those who testified. He presented his theory that Patsy Ramsey was responsible for the incident in a rage and then staged the scene to make it look like an intruder event. Detective Lou Smith also testified, but his presentation focused on evidence supporting the intruder theory. His testimony directly contradicted Thomas's and provided grand jurors with an alternative explanation. Medical experts testified about JonBenét's medical findings. A major head trauma was described as serious enough to cause immediate unconsciousness, while additional forensic indicators of restriction were reported sometime later. This sequence raised questions about whether the outcome was accidental or intentional. Forensic experts presented evidence about the ransom note, the staging of the scene, and the DNA findings that were available at the time. Handwriting analysts offered their opinions, though these conclusions were far from definitive. The grand jurors were able to see photographs from the scene and examine physical evidence that had never been made public. Burke Ramsey's testimony was particularly significant because he was the only other person known to be in the house when the incident concerning JonBenét occurred. Now old enough to provide more detailed testimony, Burke could potentially provide crucial information. The content of his testimony remains sealed, but it's known that he testified for several hours over multiple sessions. Some investigators had theorized that Burke might have been involved in the incident, either accidentally or intentionally, and that his parents may have shielded him to protect the family. Others believed that Burke might have witnessed something that could identify the responsible party. As the grand jury process continued, speculation about its likely outcome intensified. Most observers expected that if any indictments were returned, they would be against John and Patsy Ramsey. The focus of the investigation had been on the parents for nearly 3 years, and most of the evidence presented seemed designed to support or refute theories of family involvement. But there were signs that the grand jury was considering alternative theories as well. Witnesses connected to the intruder theory testified at length, and evidence about neighborhood break-ins was presented. In October 1999, the grand jury completed its deliberations. District Attorney Alex Hunter scheduled a press conference, and media from around the world gathered, expecting to finally learn whether charges would be filed in JonBenét's case. What Hunter announced shocked everyone. He stated that the grand jury had completed its work, but that he would not be filing charges against anyone. He carefully worded his statement to say that the grand jury's work had not provided him with sufficient evidence to warrant prosecution. Most observers interpreted this to mean that the grand jury had declined to return any indictments, concluding there wasn't probable cause to charge anyone, but that interpretation was completely wrong. What really happened was far more complicated. The truth remained secret for nearly 15 years until legal challenges finally forced the disclosure of documents. The grand jury hadn't declined to return indictments. They had actually voted to indict both John and Patsy Ramsey, but not for the act itself. The charges the grand jury approved were highly unusual, placing a child at risk resulting in a critical outcome, a legal term for negligence, an accessory to a crime. These charges suggested that the grand jurors believed John and Patsy were responsible for placing JonBenét in a situation that led to her tragic outcome and that they had helped obscure the incident after the fact. But District Attorney Hunter had refused to sign the indictments, effectively nullifying the charges. His reasoning was that while a grand jury only needs to find probable cause, a prosecutor must believe they can prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt at trial. Hunter didn't believe the evidence was strong enough to win a conviction, so he declined to prosecute despite the grand jury's recommendation. This decision was within his discretion, but it created a situation where the public was completely misled. Instead of learning that 12 citizens had found probable cause to believe the Ramseys were involved, the public was told that no charges were being filed. The charge of placing a child at risk was particularly significant because it suggested the grand jury believed JonBenét's passing might not have been intentional. This charge is typically used in cases where caregivers are criminally negligent. The accessory charge suggested that even if John and Patsy hadn't been directly involved in the initial act, the grand jury believed they had helped cover it up after it occurred. This could explain the ransom note and the staging of the scene. But what did these charges actually mean? Did the jury believe one parent was responsible while the other helped cover it up? Did they think Burke was responsible and his parents concealed his involvement? The sealed nature of the proceedings means these questions may never be answered. What's clear is that after examining all available evidence, 12 ordinary citizens concluded that John and Patsy Ramsey bore some criminal responsibility for what happened to their daughter. The revelation of the secret indictments in 2013 reignited controversy. If the grand jury was right, then the DA's decision had allowed them to escape accountability. If the grand jury was wrong, its secret conclusion had unfairly branded innocent parents. But the grand jury's work had another significant impact. The conclusion that the parents bore some responsibility encouraged investigators to continue focusing on family involvement theories, potentially allowing the real responsible party to escape detection. The secret grand jury represents one of the most controversial aspects of the JonBenét case, leaving it as unsolved as ever. New evidence and new theories would continue to emerge, keeping this case active nearly 3 decades after the life of a young girl ended tragically in her own home. The JonBenét Ramsey case didn't just divide public opinion, it tore apart the Boulder Police Department and created a civil war among investigators. 2 of the most experienced detectives working the case reached completely opposite conclusions, and their conflict reveals just how complex the evidence really was. This internal battle shows why this case has remained unsolved for nearly 30 years. And if you've been following along, tell me in the comments which detective's theory makes more sense to you, because their disagreement highlights the fundamental challenge of interpreting the evidence in this case. Detective Steve Thomas joined the Boulder Police Department in 1994 and was assigned to the JonBenét case just days after the incident. Ambitious and dedicated, he became increasingly frustrated with what he saw as interference from prosecutors and obstacles from the Ramsey family's legal team. Thomas developed a specific theory and pursued it with single-minded determination. He believed that Patsy Ramsey was responsible for the incident in a moment of extreme frustration and then created an elaborate cover-up. The theory centered on bedwetting. JonBenét had recently begun having accidents again, which Thomas believed was causing significant stress for Patsy, who was known to be meticulous about appearances. According to Thomas, JonBenét had an accident Christmas night, and when Patsy discovered it, she lost control. In his theory, Patsy may have struck JonBenét with a household item, possibly a flashlight, resulting in a serious head trauma that caused unconsciousness. Realizing the trauma was severe and potentially critical, Patsy then allegedly used the improvised mechanism, which contributed to the tragic outcome, to make the event appear to be the result of an intruder. Thomas believed that Patsy then spent hours staging the scene. She wrote the ransom note, she may have redressed JonBenét to obscure evidence, and she placed her in the basement wine cellar. This theory explained many puzzling aspects. The ransom note's intimate knowledge made sense if it was written by Patsy. The lack of forced entry was explained by the fact that no one had entered from outside. The mixed signals at the scene, showing both harm and moments of care, reflected Patsy's conflicted emotions. Thomas pointed to behavioral evidence he believed supported his theory. Patsy's demeanor seemed controlled, her decision to hire attorneys immediately suggested consciousness of guilt, and her refusal to cooperate fully indicated she had something to hide. Most importantly, Thomas believed that handwriting analysis supported his theory, with several experts finding similarities between Patsy's handwriting and the ransom note. But Thomas faced significant opposition from within his own department. Detective Lou Smith, who had been brought out of retirement specifically to work on the case, developed a completely different theory based on the same evidence. Smith was a legendary detective with a decades-long career solving difficult cases. He had been personally requested by the district attorney to provide an experienced perspective, and his reputation gave his opinion significant weight within the investigation. And so the trail splinters, leaving us with more questions than answers. A child's life ended tragically, a family was shattered, and justice remains elusive. What is the true legacy of this case? Is it a story about the secrets families keep, the fallibility of an investigation, or the way a tragedy can become a permanent fixture in public fascination? If you had to choose one path, the family's involvement or the lone intruder, which direction does the evidence point you? This isn't just a cold case, it's a reflection of our deepest fears and a testament to the fact that sometimes the truth is the hardest thing to find. Thanks for watching. How do you feel about these arguments and theories? Does it give you a different perspective on the case? Leave your thoughts in the comments and don't forget to subscribe to the channel to receive the latest notifications.